So in 1-8, we're looking at visual models of fractions and decimals. What? Right here. Here we're using place value blocks to model 4/10ths and 37/100ths. Then write the decimals to show the same answers. Okay? So notice they've given us tens place value blocks. Everybody understand that? Yes. In this instance, the model is representing a less than whole number. So when we work with less than whole numbers, we're working with decimals. So on our place value chart at the front of the room, that is those 3 digits that follow that decimal point. Tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. This week we've been working with tenths and hundredths because we've been working with money. Everybody remember that? Today you're looking at place value blocks. So if you needed a visual aid, you could draw hundredths and you could draw tenths by using these blocks. Thumbs up if you understand. Okay. So what they've given us is a visual representation or a model. In this model, it shows us 4 tens place value blocks as 4/10ths. Okay? So that is the same thing as having your place value chart with a decimal in the middle. These are your ones. These are your tenths. And the next digit would be your hundredths. Okay? In this case, we have a 0 in the ones place, and we have 4/10ths represented by the model. Okay? So as a fraction, 4/10ths is 10 as a denominator, 4 as a numerator. Numerator is the number on top. Denominator is the number on bottom. Anybody absent? One second. In the next model, you have 37 hundredths. So how is the 3 in the tens position represented by the model? How is the 3 in the tens position represented by the model? Anyone? How is the 3 in the tenths position represented by the model? What did they use as a model? 3 what?
Cubes.
Not cubes, because cubes are 1.
Tens.
3 tenths. Okay? But then it says there's 7 cubes. If you put those together, you would have 37 out of 100. Okay? So the 3 tens bars, the 3 tens bars are your 3 tenths, and the 7 cubes are your 7 hundredths. What that were to look like if you had a hundredths block is 37 squares of that block would be shaded. Does that make sense? So, here we have 3 tenths. 3 tens represent that. We have 7 cubes, in this case 7 hundredths, giving us, remember we keep our decimals lined up just like when we added money yesterday. We can add this 0 to give them the same number of place values. It's still going to be the same value because we're adding the 0 at the end and we're working with a decimal. Everybody understand that? So when I add them up, I definitely want to have the same number of digits to add. There's nothing in front of the decimal, so I leave a 0 there. So 37 100ths, again 100 is your denominator, and 37 is your numerator. Okay? Now, this hundredths block that they're giving us here represents a whole number 1. So if we had 3 of these blocks, what would that represent?
300.
Not 300, but 3, right? Because we're dealing with decimal models right now. 1 tens block or tens model is equal to 1/10, and the little tiny cube is equal to 100th. Now, let's put that into perspective looking at this hundreds block, right? How many cubes are inside this block? 100, right? That's where our 1/100ths comes from, because if 1 cube in this block was shaded, then 1/100th is shaded. That just means 1 out of 100. Make sense? 1 out of 100 is 1/100th. Okay? Here in the guided practice, they're asking us to write the decimal for the model shown. Well, they give us the fraction, right? So if they're giving us 70 over 100, meaning 70 out of 100, we can also count the tenths modeled here, right? There are 1 10, 2 10, 3 10, 4 10, 5 10, 6 10, 7 of these tens models shaded. So what does that look like on a place value chart? If we have 7 tenths, if this was our decimal and this was our tenths place, this would be our decimal, this would be our digit. Does everybody understand that? But they're asking us to give them the decimal out of 100. So what do you think goes in the hundredths place on the place value chart? What would go in the hundredths place? If only 7...
0.
There you go. 0. So 7 tens are shaded, but if you were to count each individual cube, how many do you think would be shaded? If we have 7 tens shaded, how many individual ones or hundredths cubes do you think are shaded?
70.
Excellent. So our decimal for this shaded model is 0.70. Just like we did here in this example for the chart, just like the cubes if we were to count them all. So we have 10 down and 7 across, right? 10 times 7 is what?
70.
70. And how many are shaded are 70 out of how many?
100.
100. So 0.70. Thumbs up if you understood that. Okay. Moving right along. We now have a block that has been shaded with partials, right? So if you only have 10 bars, then what is your total? 10, right? So your denominator is tenths. Now how many of those tenths have been shaded?
5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have been shaded. So our fraction looks like this. 5 out of 10, 5 tenths are shaded. How do you think I would write that decimal? Here is my decimal. I have no ones, right? But what was the first place value in my chart following the decimal?
7.
Tenths.
10.
Tenths. And how many out of 10 did we say were shaded?
75.
5. So my decimal is 5/10. Okay? So this would be read as 70 hundredths. You have a THS on the end when you're dealing with decimals. And how would we say this or write this? If this is 70 hundredths, how would we write this one? How do you say this? No. How do you say this?
5 out of 10.
That's in words, but how would we say it as it's written?
0.5.
Yes. But if we wrote 70 hundredths for this example, what would we write for this example? Yes, ma'am. Excellent. This is 5/10 as a decimal. This is 5/10 as a fraction. So we would say it or write it as 5/10. Does that make sense now what I was asking? Okay. Now let's look at number 3. Kind of a challenge question. Are the word forms for 30 over 100 and 0.30 the same? Well, if we're looking at a fraction of 30 out of 100, what does that mean? How many were shaded out of how many?
30 was shaded out of 100.
30 were shaded out of 100, right? If we looked at this decimal on a place value chart, 0.30, what place value does it end in? Hundredths, correct? So is 30 over 100 the same as 0.30?
No. Yes.
Yes, it is. So yes, because this would be said as 30 hundredths. And this would be said as 30 hundredths. Make sense? Okay, this says, how could you use place value blocks to model 7/10? So which place value block from the top of your page would you be using?
10.
The tens, right? How many of those would you need?
7.
Try again.
10.
10.
Which makes 100.
So we would have 10 tens blocks. I did 9, so I've got to add one more. So there's 10 of them, right? So this represents my denominator of 7/10. Now how do I show that 7/10 are shaded?
You shade 7 of them.
Excellent. So I'm going to shade 7. Right? Now how do I make 7/10 into a decimal? You can use...
7 out of 10.
That's not what I asked. How do I make this fraction into a decimal? I took this fraction, 5/10, and made it into 0.5, which on my place value chart means I have 0 ones, decimal, and 5/10, right? So how would 7/10 as a fraction be changed into a decimal?
70?
No, 70 is a whole number.
No. 10 out of 100.
Here's my decimal. It separates the whole numbers from the less than whole numbers. Okay? How many ones do I have in 7/10? How many ones, whole numbers, do I have in 7/10?
7.
Remember, this is less than 1. How many whole numbers or ones do I have in 7/10?
70. 100.
0. There is no whole number here. Right? This is a partial. Because this is the whole. Do I have that many? No, I do not have 100. I only have 10 here. Agreed? So my ones is 0. How about my tenths? How many tenths do I have? I have 7.
4.
I don't know where you're getting your numbers, babe. I have 7 out of 10 shaded, so I have 7/10 shaded. Agreed? So 7/10 as a fraction looks like this as a decimal. Does that make sense? 7/10 as a fraction looks like this as a decimal. This first digit after the decimal is your 10th digit.